Now let's summarize what we learned in the previous lecture, and then we will deep dive into the decoder side as well. So once you know the transformer architecture, you will know which model you need to pick depending on your requirement, whether you have to pick encoder model or decoder model or encoder decoder both, right? For example, let's say you're trying to perform different tasks, right? NLP, that is natural language processing. NLP is a computer science field that enables computers to understand and use human language, right? NLP has many applications. For example, let's consider sentiment classification, right? This is a supervised problem, and in sentiment classification we will pass the input to the model. That is, you have a bunch of text and you want to classify that text into groups, right? And you want to predict whether it is a positive sentiment or negative sentiment, and you know the actual value, right? So you can calculate the loss and retain the model accordingly until the model understands the pattern. So here you can just use the encoder model itself, right? Because you are not generating anything here. All you're trying to do is just trying to classify whether it is a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment, right? So in this case, you don't really need a decoder model. All you need is just the encoder model itself. For example, you can use BERT as it is a encoder model, right? And another example is NER, means named entity recognition, right? So by using this, you can identify what is the organization name, what is the date present or location present or all the people present in that organization, etc., right? So you can try to extract from the text, right? So you can just use encoder model here. You do not need decoder because you are not generating anything. All you're trying to do is you're just trying to extract from the input text, right? And the another example is text summarization, right? So let's assume you have a long test. For example, company's 10K report, right? 10K report means comprehensive overview of a public company's business, financial condition and results of operations, including audited financial statements, right? So all this information will be present in the company's 10K report. And let's say you just joined a company and you want to review the 10K report, right? And it's overwhelming to go through the long report, right? So in this case, you can just summarize and go through quickly by using this text summarization model, right? So you can just use the encoder model here because you're not trying to generate anything. All you're trying to do is just you are trying to summarize the text, right? So you don't need decoder here. You can just use encoder model and summarize your long text. And the next example is text generation, right? So given a context, you want to generate the next token or word, right? So you're trying to generate something. So you need decoder model, for example, GPT. And the next example is relationship extraction. For example, let's say you have two companies. Company ABC acquired company XYZ, right? So here the relationship is acquired. So you can represent the relationship and create a knowledge graph for the better understanding of the relationship between ABC and XYZ companies, right? So you can go through the relationship extraction and you can quickly prepare a report, right? So in this case, you are not trying to generate anything. You're just trying to understand the relationship between two entities. So you can just use encoder model here because you are not generating anything, right? And the next example is language translation, right? So for example, let's say you're trying to translate from English to Spanish, right? In this case, we need both encoder and decoder. That is, one focuses on the source, that is English. The other one focus on the target, that is Spanish, right? So we need both encoder and decoder, but we will deep dive into this. So we will understand both encoder and decoder, right? So now you know BERT is an encoder model which is good for classification or sentiment analysis or NER tasks, right? Whereas GPT, that is a decoder model, when you want to translate some language or generate something, right, then you go for GPT. And if you are just trying to classify instead of generating, you don't really need GPT, right? You can just use BERT. So once you know the transformer architecture, right, that is both encoder and decoder, then for what kind of application you will know what kind of model, that is encoder or encoder decoder models to use. You can save cost and improve the accuracy because you know which model works best for what kind of application, right? For example, let's take an application which requires both encoder and decoder, so we can learn both encoder and decoder side, right? So let me take you to this article. I found this is very helpful. So this is the article by J. Alamar, right? So first let me explain at a high level, then we will deep dive. So here if you notice, we are passing Spanish input to the transformer and we are trying to get the output in English, that is Spanish to English translation. So we need both encoder and decoder in order to do this task, right? All we are trying to do is we are trying to do the language translation here, right? So once you pass this Spanish words to the transformer, then what happens? It goes to the encoder model, right? So what happens here? You will pass the Spanish sentence to the model as the input, right? And then you know the flow. Every sentence will be tokenized and every token will have a number, right? That is the token ID. And then we will add the special characters CLS and SCP, right? Classification and separator that will be appended to the tokens, and then you will get the embeddings here. And then the next step is we will calculate the positional encoding, and then we will add both embeddings and positional encoding. Then you will get the embeddings with positional encoding, right? And after this, self-attention mechanism, right? So attention will give you the context, that is the relationship of every word with respect to every other word. And then we will use softmax to normalize, and then we will get a number between 0 to 1. So that is the attention score, right? Then that self-attention will be passed to ANN, right? This is the feed forward network, and you will get self-attention. Then again we will pass to ANN, and we will repeat this step 6 times. As you can see in the diagram, we will pass 6 times to these encoders, right? So what is the encoder output? After passing 6 times, the final output is Spanish word attention, right? That is the model knows every word versus every other word relationship between those Spanish words, and every Spanish word context has been captured by this encoder. So the encoder understood the complete input Spanish sequence. So what happens next? So now the next step is decoder flow, right? So in the decoder, the first input, that is the start, that will be passed. The start is a special sequence, okay? And then again the same flow. Again we will apply the embeddings, and then we will convert start into embeddings. So start is the starting sequence to the decoder model, that will be converted to embeddings, and then we will calculate the positional encoding, and then we will add both embeddings with the positional encoding. Then we will get embeddings with the positional encoding for the starting sequence only, and then we will apply masked self-attention. So this is the only difference when compared to encoder. In encoder we have self-attention, here it is masked self-attention, right? But the rest of the steps are the same between both encoder and decoder. And we will use key vector K, value vector V from encoder model, and we will use query vector from decoder masked self-attention, right? So decoder only works with target, that is English, right? And because of the encoder decoder attention, so if you see here, in encoder we have self-attention and feed forward, and in decoder we have self-attention, feed forward. You see the additional one here, encoder decoder attention. So because of this encoder decoder attention, the model understands that the word J in Spanish is related to the word I, okay? So J is related to the word I, Sus is related to the word yam, right? So that is how the model understands the relationship between Spanish and English because of the encoder decoder attention. And in encoder, the model understands Spanish word versus every other Spanish word context relationship, right? And in decoder, it predicts J means I, right? So that is, this J is related to the word I, Spanish to English, right? Then in the next step, so first we passed start as the input sequence, and then it predicted J means I, and then both predicted values I and start, that is the starting sequence, will be again passed to decoder model. Again the process repeats, right? And again it will calculate the embeddings, and then again positional encoding, and then masked self-attention. Then the next word will be predicted, right? So what is the next word? Yam. Then I am, and then the starting sequence, right? These three will be passed again to the decoder model. Again the process repeats, embeddings, positional encoding, masked self-attention, then the next word will be predicted, right? So at a time the decoder is trying to generate the next word, only one word, it's actually one token at a time, right? And the process will stop once it sees the special token SCP at the end of the sentence, right? So depending on the task that you are trying to work on, you need to pick either encoder or encoder decoder model, right? For example, for language translation, we used both encoder and decoder. And whereas in classification, you just need encoder itself. You don't need decoder because you're not trying to generate anything. And in case of NER, just encoder is enough because you're not trying to generate anything, so you don't need decoder. And when you're trying to predict the text, right, you're trying to generate something, in that case you need GPT, you don't need encoder, right? So now you understood the difference between encoder and decoder at a high level, right? That is, in case of encoder it is self-attention, right? Whereas in case of decoder it is masked self-attention. So now you understood the difference between encoder and decoder models, right? At a high level, in encoder it is self-attention, whereas in decoder it is masked self-attention. Okay, so that is the only difference, and remaining all the steps are almost the same. Now let's go back to this article and deep dive. So what we did first, we passed the Spanish input to the transformer to translate this Spanish into English, right? So that is our intent. And the next step is we have encoder and decoder, right? So inside the transformer we have both encoder and decoder. And again, if you deep dive, we have 6 encoders and 6 decoders, right? The more and more encoders you will repeat, the better patterns you can identify, right? So that's the only objective of why we are repeating here. And if you deep dive more, in encoder we have self-attention and feed-forward neural network. This is ANN, right? And if you deep dive more, in every encoder we have self-attention and feed-forward, that is ANN, artificial neural network. And encoder focus only on the input, that is Spanish, and decoder always focus on the target, that is English, right? And in decoder we have 3 things: self-attention, encoder decoder attention, and feed-forward, right? We have this extra thing, encoder decoder attention. So this will give how the Spanish word is related to English word, right? And if you want to see the code, let me show code as well. So if you go to this GitHub URL, right, here they have provided the code for translating from English to German, right, with a pre-trained model. So if you are interested, you can deep dive and look into this code as well. And if you want to see visually, right, so here you have the code as well, and you can also see the visual part, right? So if you see here in the attention, you have input input, input output, and output output, right? So input input means encoder self-attention, right? That is each word with respect to each other word. That is the relationship between each English word with respect to each other English word. That is input input, which is encoder. And input output means encoder decoder self-attention, that is English to German, right? So this will help how each word in encoder relates to each other word in the decoder, right? And the next attention is output output, right? So output output means decoder self-attention, right? That is German to German, every word in German to each other word in German, right? So whichever word has the highest attention score, that will be predicted as the next word in the sequence, right? Now let's go back to this article so we can deep dive. So now let's understand the input, right? So each word may be splitted into multiple tokens, right? So not just one word to one token, right? But just to keep it simple, let's assume this one word is converted to one token, right? Just for understanding. So this is the input text that will be converted to tokens, and then we will get the token ID, right? And then what happens? The next step is self-attention, right? That is, it will try to understand the relationship between each word with respect to each other word in the input sequence. That is J with respect to J, Sus, etudient, right? Similarly, Sus with respect to Sus, J, etudient, right? And then etudient with respect to etudient, J, and Sus, like we saw in this example, right? So it will try to understand each word with respect to each other word in the input sequence. Then that will be passed to ANN, that is feed forward network, and you will get the self attention. And you know the self attention is matrix multiplication, right? And what happens next? And we will pass that to 6 encoders, right? That is output of encoder 1 will be passed to encoder 2, and encoder 2 output will be passed to encoder 3, etc. And then similarly output of encoder 5 will be passed to encoder 6, right? So that is how we'll calculate the self attention. And if you notice self attention at a high level, the objective of self attention is which word is closely related to which other word in the input sequence, right? So if you see the sequence here, the animal didn't cross the street because it was too tired, right? So it is trying to understand the relationship of each word with respect to each other word, right? So that is the objective of self attention. And if you notice here, we have query matrix that will be calculated again using ANN, right? And key matrix and value matrix as well. So if we deep dive, we have 2 by 4, right? This 2 by 4 times this is 4 by 3, and then you will get 2 by 3, right? 2 by 3, this is the matrix multiplication, right? So you will get query vector. This query vector contains input, embeddings plus positional encoding. And similarly, this is the input sequence, and then this is the key matrix. We will do the matrix multiplication and we will get the key vector. And this is the input sequence, and this is the value matrix. We will do the matrix multiplication and we'll get the value vector. And then how to get the self attention? So we will matrix multiply query vector and transpose of key vector, right? And then we will multiply with the value vector as well. That's how we will get the self attention, right? This entire thing is just for one head, right? And if you want to see the entire process, you can see here. So first we are trying to pass the input, and then next thing is we are generating the embeddings, and then we'll get the query key and value vectors, right? When we multiply input embeddings with query key and value matrix, right? And then we'll get the attention score. Here in this paper they're trying to divide by 8, then softmax, then multiply value with that, and then we'll get Z1 and Z2. These two are the self attention score, right? So we did this for one head. This paper says we need to do for 8 times, right? So that is for the multi-head. And then we will calculate all the attention scores, Z0, Z1, so on, Z7. This is for the multi-head. This is how we will calculate. It is a multi-dimensional array, right? We will flatten by multiplying with all the weights W0 and pass it to ANN, because ANN allows only vector form but not the matrix form, right? So that is how we'll calculate the final attention for the multi-head. So we are learning the architecture of the transformer behind the LLM, right? But in generative AI, we are not building an LLM, right? But for your understanding how the LLM functions behind the scene, we are trying to understand the transformer architecture, okay? If you are interested, you can build an LLM once you know the architecture, right? Because you already have the code as well. But you need two things, right? So the number one is you need data to train the model, and the number two is GPU to process the data. And there will be a lot of CO2 emission as well, right? Carbon dioxide emission during this training process, right? And you also need to be careful with ethical AI, right? Let me show an example. So if you see this article, right? So a college student in Michigan received a threatening response during a chat with Google AI's chatbot Gemini, right? So what it sent, this is for you human, you and only you. You are not special, you are not important, and you are not needed. You are a waste of time and resources. You are a burden on society. You are a drain on the earth. You are a blind on the landscape. You are a stain on the universe. Please die. Please, right? So you also have to be careful when you're trying to build any models, right? And in real time, it is not just transformers, right? We will also have reinforcement as well. That is, if you see the gaming applications, they use reinforcement architecture, right? Now let's understand the decoder side as well. So far we saw encoder. Now let's deep dive decoder side as well. So this is the decoder side. So here what we're trying to do, we need to translate the input words thinking and machines, right? So this input to the decoder is, we will pass the starting sequence and we'll get the token ID, and then we'll do the positional encoding right? Similar to how we did before for the encoder model. And then we will apply the self-attention. That is, in step number 1, there is only the starting sequence. So it calculates the self-attention for only starting sequence in the decoder, right? So if you notice the diagram here, from the encoder, we will take the key and value vector, and from the decoder, we will take the query vector, and we will do the encoder's decoder attention, right? And this output of decoder along with the starting sequence will be fed again to the decoder model, right? So let's see the visual diagram so it will be clear for you. Let's see the decoder time steps here, right? So first, the starting sequence will be passed to the decoder model, and then it will try to predict the first word, that is I. So we are taking key and value from the encoder and query from this decoder and trying to predict the next word, that is I, right? And in the second step, it predicted am. And then again what happens, the previous outputs, the starting sequence I am will be passed again, it will predict A. And then again I am A, it will be passed to this, and then it will predict student. And then again starting sequence I am a student will be passed again, and then it will go to the end of the sequence and it will stop generating, right? So the encoder knows the relationship or context between input sequence words, right? These are the Spanish words. And decoder knows the relationship or context of the target, only one word at a time, right? And with encoder decoder cross attention, right? That is how the model knows the relationship between J means I, sus, right? So that is how it will identify the relationship between Spanish and English word. That's how the model is able to predict and generate the output, right? Remember, only one word at a time, right? That is, it's actually one token at a time it is trying to predict, not the entire sequence in one go, right? It is only one word or one token at a time, right? So far we saw an example of both encoder decoder, right? Encoder decoder transformer architecture with a language translation example. Now I have another article that shows only decoder model. So let me take you here, so we can see only decoder part of it, right? If you see here, why do you need this masked self-attention in the decoder? Because the decoder only knows the attention score of only the starting sequence in step number 1, and remaining all will be masked. And in step number 2, we will pass starting sequence and the predicted word, and then it will know the score of the starting sequence and robo, right? And remaining all will be masked, right? So it only predict the starting sequence and the remaining all will be masked with infinite. And in this next step, starting sequence and the first word and the remaining all will be masked. Starting sequence, the remaining 2 predictions, and the remaining will be masked. So that is how we are doing the masked self-attention, right? It only knows the score of this and the previous words, and the remaining all will be masked, right? Here we are setting to infinite because the soft max of infinite is 0. Right? This is the only difference between encoder and decoder. One is self-attention, the other one is masked self-attention, right? So now let's go back to that article so we can deep dive. This is a nice decoder example, right? So first thing is we are passing the starting sequence. In step number 1, it only predicts the, only one word. And in the next step, what happens? We are passing again starting sequence and the predicted word, that is the, to the decoder model, and it predicts thing. And then again in step number 3, we will pass starting sequence, the, and the predicted word thing, and then it will predict the next word, right? And so on. So one word at a time, right? Or one token at a time actually. That is how the decoder predicts. All right. So now let me ask you a question here. So what is the difference between BERT, encoder, and GPT? Decoder models, right? So BERT means that is an encoder model. In encoder model, every word knows the context of every other word, that is, it is bidirectional. Whereas in GPT, that is a decoder model, it only knows the previous word's context in order to predict the next word, right? Because the remaining all scores will be masked. It only knows that word score and the previous scores, so it can predict the next word, right? So that is the only difference between encoder and decoder based models. So now you know both encoder and decoder side of the transformer architecture, right? And which model to use to solve what kind of problems, right? So that is the whole architecture of transformer. All right, thank you.